Hey guys, welcome back to Snake Limited, and this is going to be part 2 of my morph market buyer seller awareness store policy kind of knowledge-based guide. Today I wanted to talk about what your rights and responsibilities are as a buyer when you're purchasing a snake through morph market. Okay, so where do you start? You're a buyer, you've never purchased a snake before. And this is kind of a lot of comments that I've had over the years are from people that are kind of worried about buying a snake online. They're used to going to reptile shows and purchasing directly from a breeder that has a snake sitting on a table, but they're worried about purchasing a snake through somebody that is on the internet, quite frankly. Start by reading the buyer's guide on Morph Market. I'll post a screenshot here of it, but I'll also post the link below. Read the buyer's guide. It's a really good starting point to kind of let you know what you should be looking for, what you should be wary of, and it kind of gives you at least a little bit of knowledge to feel comfortable that buying from Morph Market is a safe thing to do. Take it from somebody who has bought and sold a lot of snakes over the course of 4.5 years on Morph Market. It's generally safe to do. I've only had maybe 1 or 2 issues out of the 100 plus, probably 150 plus snakes that I've either bought or sold on there. So the likelihood of you buying 1 or 2 snakes or even 10 snakes and running into an issue are probably highly unlikely. But you also need to be smart with who you're buying your snakes from. The part 2 of that is to read the store policies of the potential breeders that you're looking to buy from. If you didn't see my first video about protecting yourself as a seller, I talk a lot about your store policy and customizing your store policy so that it protects you. As a buyer, you need to make sure that you're reading those store policies. Morph Market has a default store policy that they apply to every single breeder on Morph Market. Some breeders choose to customize those store policies and make it their own, and some choose to just leave it as the default. Either way, as a buyer, you need to make yourself extremely familiar with what that store policy says and what it means, because it holds both you as the buyer and the seller accountable for the transaction that you're about to make. You're buying the snake, the seller needs to honestly represent it, give you a healthy snake, ship it to you, and make sure it gets there alive. As a buyer, it's your job to make sure you're knowledgeable about the snake you're buying, make sure that you've kind of checked out the seller that you're buying from, make sure that you're okay with the purchase you're making, because you can't buy a snake and then complain about it 6 months later if you don't like what it looks like at that point. You need to make sure that you know, hey, this snake that I bought, typically, and this is a good thing maybe for a new buyer to know, ball pythons don't typically keep their colors from their hatchling size and age to adulthood. Typically the colors dull out a little bit, maybe sometimes they brown out a little bit, meaning they become a little more brown in color. They're not as vibrant. I know a lot of pastel pieds when they're born are like super yellow and just kind of really contrasty with white. A pastel pied, like white, yellow, and black. It's very contrasty. They don't look like that when they get older, and a lot of snakes do that. So you need to do your own research as a buyer, because it's not the breeder's fault if that snake doesn't look the same when you buy it as it does when it gets older. When you're buying snakes, you need to make sure that you're asking questions if you have them. The time to ask questions about a snake is before you send your payment, not afterwards. For example, I had made a couple purchases recently, and they were pretty straightforward. So I had bought a Amazon a tree boa, or emerald tree boa from Nerd. Well, it says captive bred. It didn't really matter what the weight was because I knew it was close to hatchling size, so I just purchased it. There were no questions to be had, but in the listings, Nerd says, if you have any questions, please email us and let us know. If you have questions about a snake, if you have questions about genetics, if you have questions about weight, size, ask them before you send your payment. If you send your payment and you receive the snake and there's some sort of a discrepancy that you didn't clear up before purchasing it, unless the seller was flat out lying about something. If you bought 1,000-gram snake and it arrives and it's still hatchling size, well, that's a lie. That's on the seller. That's nothing that you could have rectified beforehand necessarily. Because you could ask them to send you a picture with a snake on a scale, but they could be fudging that as well. But if you get sent a snake that is supposed to be 1,000 grams, but it shows up at 900 grams, that 100-gram difference is actually within the kind of threshold that Morph Market deems it's okay, because when they weighed that snake, it could have had its belly full. And when you receive that snake, it most likely has already defecated. And so when you defecate, you lose weight. If you're going to be concerned about that 100 grams, you should ask questions, accurate weights, before you go ahead and purchase that snake, so you're not surprised when you get it or appalled by it. But at the same time, as a buyer, you need to also be reasonable with things. You need to understand that when you're purchasing a snake, the weight isn't going to be exactly what it says on Morph Market. When I list a snake, when I list a hatchling, I take the weight when I'm taking the pictures and when I make the listing. That snake could poop the next day and it's going to lose a bit of weight. That snake could eat the next day and gain a little weight. So that snake's not going to be the same exact weight as when you purchase it. As a seller, I do my best to ID my snakes with the codom genetics. As a seller, if I list recessive genes, I guarantee that those recessive genes are in that snake. However, when I ID a snake with the codominant or incomplete dominant genes, they are a theoretical ID. I try my best to identify the genes the snake has. I do my research the best I can. I take other examples from other snakes on Morph Market that have similar traits, and that's what I list the snake as. If you don't agree with that, if you don't agree with what the ID is of those codom genes, you need to make sure that you're asking the seller before you purchase it about the parent's lineage, what the parent's traits were. If you want to ask how the seller came to the conclusion that these are what the traits are. And ultimately, if you don't agree with it, you don't have to buy the snake. Don't come back at a later date complaining because you got a second opinion from somewhere and they didn't agree with the seller's original theoretical ID. It's not going to do anybody any good. You need to make sure that you're sure of the purchase you're making up front, and negligence to do any of the research on your own isn't a good answer for why you should be angry at somebody. If you're dealing with ball pythons specifically, there are a lot of genes, and there are a lot of genetic combinations between the codoms and the recessives, and they are ever increasingly complex, especially as people are layering in 3, 4, or 5 codoms into 1 or 2 or 3 recessives. It's very hard to ID these snakes. So it's really important for you to search Morph Market and to look at comparable snakes. I do that all the time before I purchase something. I make sure that what I'm buying is what it's advertised to be. And if I don't agree with it, I either don't purchase it or I talk to the seller about it. However, there are times where genes, especially codom genes, are kind of hidden that or not there, that kind of work out for the buyer or don't work out for the buyer. For example, a few years back, I purchased an ivory leopard male breeder. He was a breeder size male. I bred him to, I believe I think a yellow belly female. And I got a bunch of ivories and I got a couple ivory leopards, but I also got some ivories out of it that had some very strange patterns. And for the life of me, I could not figure out what it was. They weren't ivory leopards. I had no idea what they were. Well, turns out after a certain amount of research, I figured out that the male also had spider in him. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole spider gene, should you or shouldn't you. Personally, I don't believe we should be breeding the spider gene. Now, the issue was, well, I had these things. I didn't want the male anymore. I ended up selling him off after the pairing when I realized what genes he had in it. But I wasn't angry at the seller for not having properly ID'd that snake. He did list the pairing that produced the male that I purchased. And guess what? It did say spider in the genetics of one of the parents. And, unfortunately for me, because I don't want to breed spider, it was in there. But at the end of the day, he still made a healthy clutch. I was able to sell the hatchlings. I was actually able to sell the male, and it worked out. I wasn't angry at the seller. I didn't even contact him about it because I know that mistakes happen. And, it was an honest mistake. I don't think he was trying to swindle me. And again, it's a co-dominant gene, and really nobody guarantees co-dominant genes. Ozzy from Aussie Boats even has a clause in his store policy stating that theoretical IDs are not guaranteed for co-dominant or incomplete dominant genes. So please be reasonable as a buyer, because you forget everybody that you're purchasing from has also bought before as well. Like, we're not just breeders. I'm also a buyer. I've sold a bunch of hatchlings, but I've also purchased a bunch of snakes as well. So I've been on both sides of this coin. I understand both sides of it. And so I know when somebody is being honest, and I know when somebody isn't being honest. I know when somebody's being reasonable, and I know when somebody isn't being reasonable. It's kind of your job as a buyer, especially because this is going to be aimed at people that are really coming into the game or newer in the industry. You need to do your own research before buying a snake. It's not up to me as a seller to make sure that you know the ins and outs of every single genetic combination in the world. You need to do your own research. It's not my fault if you don't do that. Just like I don't place the blame on a seller that I purchased from if things aren't exactly as they say they were. If the snake's a little smaller, that's okay. If the genetics are a little off the codoms, that's okay. However, if I purchased a clown het pied to make clown pieds, and I bred this male to 4 different females, and pied hasn't proven out in any of them, and I had 40 eggs, well, chances are that male was never actually het pied, so he was miscorrectly ID'd. That's an issue, and that's something that can creep back up on you as a seller for a long time down the road if you're mis-IDing recessives. But as a buyer, you need to make sure that you're aware of that, whether or not the seller is guaranteeing the recessives, but you need to be aware that the codoms are probably not going to be guaranteed and probably shouldn't be if you are the seller. What it boils down to really is educating yourself. Read the Morph Market Buyer's Guide. Make sure that if you like a snake, you're reading the seller's policy. Make sure you've researched the genetics that you're purchasing. I think most people are aware of the spider wobble issue. It's a neurological issue the spider gene has. But if the breeder doesn't have that listed in the listing for the snake, hey, this spider gene has wobble, and you purchase the snake and you realize there's something weird going on with the snake once you get it, well, that's kind of your fault. If you didn't know the spider had wobble, that means you weren't doing your research. Now, personally, there's 2 spiders that I produced from that ivory leopard clutch. I actually did list that they had spider gene, and I did list that they had wobble. That was a choice that I made, but I didn't have to do that. But I just wanted to make sure that whoever purchased the snake knew that, hey, it has wobble. You don't want to deal with it. I also let people know, as I referenced, I don't know if it's this video or the other one, if a snake is a picky eater. It's dishonest if somebody sells you a snake and it's not eating. But it's not unlikely for you to purchase a ball python and for it to not eat for you. That's the one downside to owning ball pythons, is that you're not guaranteed that they're going to eat. I've had snakes eat, you know, live with the previous owner. I buy it as a hatchling. I switch it over to frozen thawed, and it feeds regularly for its entirety of its existence with me. I've had other snakes that are supposed to be frozen thawed feeders when I purchase them, and I get them here, and they don't want to even touch a frozen thawed, so I have to start feeding them live. I've had snakes that I get them and they just don't eat when I first get them, and it takes them months to start feeding. So, you have to know the positives and negatives to the species that you're purchasing. If you are purchasing a ball python, you need to know they're picky eaters, and you need to know the kind of different hoops that you need to jump through to get them to eat. Some of them only want live, some of them only want mice, some of them only want African soft furs, some of them like to have fresh killed prey, some of them take frozen thawed without an issue. So there's a lot of different hoops you need to jump through with feeding these ball pythons, and you need to be aware of that. A lot of other snake species don't have that issue. Actually, out of all of the other snakes that I own, I have boas, I have blood pythons, I have cave-dwelling rat snakes, I have an eastern rat snake, I have a garter snake. None of them have an issue with feeding on frozen thawed. But in my ball python collection, unless I bred it, unless I raised it from a hatchling and started it off on frozen thawed, very few of them actually take frozen thawed for the rest of their lives. So be aware of that. If you're purchasing an older ball python and it eats live, you're probably going to need to keep feeding it live food. Lastly, make sure that you're just keeping an open dialogue with the seller. If you have questions about the snake after you receive it, ask them, and keep an open dialogue going around it. Again, the problem is you need to be reasonable. Speaking from the seller side of things, you can have customers that are very easygoing. You talk to them once or twice, they purchase the snake, they get it, they're happy, and you never hear from them again. There are people that, purchase a snake from you, and you keep talking through social media, and you develop friendships with them, and they're returning customers. Sometimes they're not returning customers, but you just keep talking to them anyways because you guys get along. There are customers that maybe don't purchase from you again, but keep following up with questions periodically. That's fine as well. As a buyer, you need to understand kind of where you're pushing the boundaries of what is kind of owed to you. Somebody posted this, and I don't remember exactly, but I was looking at the Patreon for mutation creation, and I was looking at the different levels of their Patreon, and one of the benefits of one of the higher tiers was, we can have phone calls discussing your collection, an unlimited amount of phone calls, and then in parentheses it says within reason. And you need to keep that in mind. Your contract with the seller, the breeder, is you're buying this snake, you receive it, it's healthy, it's accurately described, and that's it. They don't owe you anything else. A good seller or breeder is going to keep offering you support after that. If the snake's having trouble eating, well, they're going to offer you tips and guidance. They can't necessarily fix the issue for you, but they can provide you information and try to help you through it. They can offer you advice on what good future pairings would be. But you can't keep contacting the seller an unreasonable amount. So you need to make sure that you understand, hey, this whole deal was I wanted this snake and the breeder sold it to me and that's it. Anything after that is kind of the cherry on top. You need to make sure you understand that. Be reasonable with what you expect from the breeder. Again, speaking from the breeder side of things, I have a lot of things going on a daily basis. I have my normal 9-to-5 job. I have taken care of my whole ball python collection, taken care of my feeder rats. I have to worry about taking care of my house and maintaining that. I have to worry about spending time with my wife, spending time with my kids. There's all these different things that go on in my life. I don't have unlimited resources. I don't have time to sit here all day and answer questions 24/7 from everybody in the world. And that's really, I think, an issue for a lot of breeders is like having that work life boundary. The healthy yin yang coexistence between the two. And so as a buyer, you need to be aware of that like this seller, this breeder is a normal guy or girl. They have a life. They can't sit in front of their computer or phone all day and just answer questions incessantly. A lot of the questions you're going to have can probably be answered by you doing research on your own, going through YouTube, which is huge. I'm posting this sort of information here now. There are thousands of reptile content creators on YouTube that offer a ton of information. If I have a question about a snake, if I'm looking into a new species of snake that I want to purchase as a pet, I don't go find one on Morph Market and then start hounding a breeder with questions. I go to YouTube and I look up blood python care. And I look up and I watch every single video that I can on YouTube about blood python care so that there are no questions to ask the breeder other than, hey, what's its temperament like? That's a good question because blood pythons have a bad kind of history of like people thinking they have bad temperaments and that they're kind of nippy. So that's a good question. Hey, is this a nippy animal or is it, have a good temperament? I knew that from doing some research on YouTube. I wasn't asking, hey, what is this gene? What is that gene? What is this? What is that? Any of these other, how big do you think this snake's gonna get? Things like that. That's all stuff you can research on your own. Save the important questions that you need to ask for the breeder, but the stuff that you need to get answered that isn't very hard to find, please make sure that you're actually researching it by yourself so that the breeder has more time to answer the questions that you can't find the answers to on YouTube. All right, I think I've covered the bases on this topic, kind of what your rights are as a buyer of a snake on Morph Market. Read the store policies, look at the buyer's guide on Morph Market, make yourself aware of who the seller is, follow their social media accounts, do some research, see what their rankings are if they have bought and sold on Morph Market before. Sometimes you're going to run into a newer breeder that doesn't have any ratings yet, so make sure that you see they have some sort of a presence on social media and that they're not just a scam artist that's just trying to take your money. Just do your research. That's really the biggest thing that I can tell a buyer is do your research on everything. Research the store policy, research the breeder, research the genetics, research the type of snake you're buying, all of that stuff. And you really shouldn't have an issue at that point with the snake you're purchasing unless the seller was just flat out lying to you about the gender, the weight, the genes in the snake, the health of the snake. Assuming that you're buying from a reputable breeder, you're not going to run into any of those problems. And if you ask all your questions, if you get everything cleared up before making your purchase, then this buyer and seller should both walk away from the deal happy and be more than ecstatic to do business with each other again. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you have any questions about this topic, please comment below and I will try to answer them as soon as possible. And I'll see you guys next time.